Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Budget Town Hall. This is a meeting for members of the University Senate and the Faculty Council specifically. My name is Erin Johnson. I'm Assistant Vice President for Financial Strategic Initiatives and Chief of Staff to Mike Gower, the EVP CFO, and we're really glad that so many of you were able to join us today. Before we get started and I introduce our speakers, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items on the next slide. First, I would like to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar and we'll make it available to all attendees and those that were invited who weren't able to make it today. We will address questions at the end of the meeting using the Q&A feature that you can see in your Zoom at the bottom, most likely. So please do, as questions arise, put them in that Q&A. Anything that we do not address in the session, we will make a point to address in writing and share that with the group. Next. So our agenda for today is two components. First, we'll have Mike Gower, the EVP CFO, provide an overview of higher education, budget, and finance. And then we'll turn to the business and budget finance team, David Moore, our vice president, and Nayland Smith, Arcelio Aponte, Jay Robert or Bob McKee, and Kathleen Bramwell, the chief business officers and senior vice chancellors of our 4 chancellor units. Then, as I've said previously, we will open it up for Q&A and hopefully address as many of your questions as possible. With that, I'd like to invite Mike Gower. Hi, Mike.
Yes, thank you, Erin, and good morning, everyone. Very happy to have you with us. I'm Mike Gower. I'm the Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer, and University Treasurer. I've been at Rutgers for just a little over 11 years now. Came in immediately after the merger itself in 2013 and began working on the integration of the financial and administrative functions of the university at that time, and really the creation of the new Rutgers, along with many of my colleagues. Pleased to have this session today. It's a result of quite a number of conversations last year and then during the summer with Chair Foster about increasing communications and education on the university finances. So this is the first of at least 2 of these town halls that we'll be having this year. Today, we will be talking about the fiscal 25 budget. I'll give you an insight into the budget processes in place. We expect the next one to be early in the second semester, probably in February, when we'll talk about what are the types of things going on as the budget is for the fiscal 26 is being created. And we figure that a couple of these sessions each year, along with interactions with the Budget and Finance Committee and the Executive Committee, and then the full Senate as appropriate, will improve those communications around and understanding of the university finances. Just as a note, I am also a senator. I've been a senator for the entire time I've been here and been actively participating in the Senate since 2013. So I'm one of you in that sense. Our goal for today is to provide you information about the budget and how it really is put together. Thus, I'll be involving my colleagues as we go along, and you'll meet them, and then spending time answering your questions. Please again use the Q&A feature to accumulate those questions. Erin will be moderating those towards the end. We'll get as many of them in this session as possible, and then we'll be posting both this recording and answers to any questions that we aren't able to get to in time onto a website that we'll make available to everyone. Next. Just a quick overview. I oversee a division here called University Finance Administration. That division includes quite a number of units. They're listed here, ranging from audit ethics, compliance, to risk management, to enrollment services, which is a new function as of last April, enrollment services and financial aid. And then what I call the affiliated functions, such as research, financial services, university, HR, IT. I have direct ties to the chief business officers of the chancellor units. They work for both their respective chancellors and for me. We work in matrix organization with them, and it has worked very well over the time I have been here. In addition to our division's regular engagement and day-to-day interaction with members of the community, we also engage in university forums regularly, such as the virtual finance town halls and cornerstone forums. And we'll have information about upcoming ones of those at the end of this meeting. We also have regular conversations or regular information about project initiatives like the recently completed transition to Rutgers Travel and Expense Management System. And then we host events like this that I'm hoping to not be just a one and done, but a regular occurrence every year. Next. I invite you to visit our website, which is finance.rutgers.edu, to learn more about our organization, find pertinent information about finance administration. I also ask you, as you look at that, to send us suggestions about additional information that you would like to have here. Websites can always be improved, can always be enhanced, and we look for feedback on that. I'd like to highlight sections in this site. In the top menu is a resource library where you can find information on our work, access particular systems and tools, refer to FAQs, find training information, and review the recordings of past finance town halls. In the quick links section, you can find our new and revamped policy library and further information about the budget and finances of the university, including annual finance and audit reports, the current year budget, and so on. Also included is the allocation of resources across campuses. That is an annual report that we provide, we post publicly and also provide to the state, that works as a crosswalk to show how funds flow across the university. The fiscal 24 document will be added to that site later this year, but you can view the fiscal 23 version there now. Next slide. I have this slide here as a prompt to spend a few minutes talking about the role of the CFO. I've been a CFO at universities for now it's 23 years. 3 different institutions. Before that, I was CFO of a major medical school. The role has become increasingly diverse and complex over time. A lot of different elements that are necessary within this role that have been increasingly more strategic as time has gone on. In particular, here at Rutgers, large and complex organization, creating a new financial structure from the largest merger in higher education history, probably will always be the largest one, was a complex task that involved hundreds and hundreds of people and a lot of discussions, and is still going on to this day in some respects. So the role of this CFO is not a control mechanism at the top of an ivory tower, but is instead a highly collaborative position, especially as it relates to an organization that crosses 4 different chancellor-led units, such as this one. So during today's town hall, it's my goal to ensure that you come away from this presentation with a more robust understanding of our work and how the organization works, especially the work of the chief business officers within the chancellor-led units, how they enable the work all of you do as part of and on behalf of the university. Next. With that, I want to briefly turn to some comments about budget and finance and higher ed. And I don't have time to cover everything here, but a few things that are interest. Next. The National Association of College and University Business Officers is the professional organization that covers professional development and advocacy for people like me and for the higher education business functions across the United States. This summer, there was the annual survey of people like me to identify the top higher education business issues that NACUBO conducted. They just issued the list of the top 5 issues. And it rose to the top here: technology, workforce, communicating mission and value, which has become increasingly important, ensuring successful student outcomes, and navigating resource constraints. These speak to Rutgers very much, every one of them. And as we move forward in the path towards greater financial sustainability, the other elements here are extraordinarily important towards that. At the Finance Town Hall on November 6th, I'm going to be digging into these in more depth. We'll also put a link to the site that contains this in the chat and in the excuse me, meeting materials, so that you can look at it at your leisure. Next slide. So financial sustainability has been an initiative that started many years ago, actually, as we looked at coming out of COVID and recognizing that we were going to be facing structural operating deficits going forward. We were coming out of that with lower revenues because of enrollment stresses and change in our enrollment composition, to increased expenses of all types that related to operating the university, and to the impact of inflation upon us, as well as additional costs that were required as a result of the pandemic. And in this metaphor, we choose puzzle pieces because it illustrates how a financial strategy is important to complete the puzzle to support the many priorities of the university. And those priorities certainly being the excellence of our academic programs, the quality of our student experience, the impact of our research and clinical care, and investment in our facilities and technologies. There's an old adage that says, no money, no mission. The mission is the most important element, but we have to have the resources to be able to conduct that mission in the best possible way. Rutgers needs to work itself towards a position of financial sustainability, so that we can ensure that the university survives, and not just survives, but thrives. We need to do more than close our structural deficit, keep the doors open year after year. We must make decisions so that we have resources to invest in our facilities, to invest in new programs, to invest in our student services, and to invest in our continued development in research, clinical care, and education. Next. So as I noted, we came out of COVID, and we saw this coming, that there would be a structural operating deficit that built up over a number of years. Again, was exacerbated by issues that took place during the pandemic, in particular around enrollment, and in particular around our cost structure. There are a lot of things that contribute to our financial challenges. This represents the position that we are in the current fiscal year, where we're running an operating deficit and have to address that. But we want to address it in a prudent and thoughtful way. We want to do it over the course of a number of years, so that we do not disrupt what we have going on, but instead make it better. Next slide. And we have made progress. We have worked on a number of things that have provided us real progress towards a financial sustainability place. New ways of doing things, new collaborations, the opportunities that we have going forward for innovation. I'm really looking forward to building on the great innovation that happens within this university to address this. This is not about cutting costs, although that has to be part of it at some point in the game. But instead, it is about how do we expand the university while becoming more efficient, but also more effective. Next slide. For the past year and a half, my leadership team and I, among many others, have been working with the chancellors and the president to identify ways that we can make a difference. That work culminated this summer with the board adoption of financial strategy. This strategy, which was made university policy by the board in June, establishes where we intend to be over the next 5 years so that we are in a position to generate a bottom line, not for a bottom line's sake, but for reinvestment in things such as deferred maintenance, technology, which also has its own deferred maintenance, program development, investment in critical key areas of the university for academic research or other programs, and to build back as appropriate reserves that we are now using to have a reasonable glide path, a reasonable runway towards correcting the structural deficit, instead of doing a crash in what I call the West Virginia method, West Virginia University method of addressing an operating deficit in a matter of months. We are going to take a reasonable period of time, a number of years, and use our reserves as a mechanism to glide our path towards that. And pardon me, I have a cold that I'm working on. And it is causing a little bit of phlegm here. If you take a look at this strategy, which is in the policy library, it codifies a set of financial performance metrics, but also principles that are important. Again, it is about how do we sustain and thrive with the mission going forward, not finance for finance's sake, but how that is going to help us in order to meet the mission and thrive as we go along. We were very, very, very lucky during COVID to have significant support from the federal government and from the state government to get through there. We need to be able to build greater resiliency so that when the next crisis happens, we're not as dependent on the government in order to stay afloat and keep moving. We want to thrive, and we want to be able to reinvest in critical areas such as deferred maintenance that are clearly an issue for all of you. So in the interest of time, I could spend a lot of time on this, but I want to take just a few more minutes to talk about higher education finance and how it relates back to us, and then turn it over to my colleagues. Next. So what is a budget? I mean, it's very straightforward. A budget is a plan. There are many budgets within a university. There's the institutional level budgets that you hear about. There are individual unit budgets, there are program budgets, there are project budgets, there are grant budgets. There are a lot of different ones. There are also two very common types of budgets at an institution. One is operating, the year-to-year costs of keeping the university going, the year-to-year revenues. And then there's a capital budget where we talk about multiple year projects. Next. As I said, operating budgets refer to the revenues and expenses for day-to-day operations for things such as the libraries, to repay debt, to pay employees, and to conduct our missions. The revenues of the university include, and you'll see this in detail, tuition and fees, patient and clinical care payments, payments for housing and dining, donations, gifts, many of which are restricted, as well as appropriations for a public institution such as us, and endowment investment income. Expense, most prominent expense in any university is personnel. It includes salary and benefits. And you'll see that how it relates in each of the chancellor-led units as you go along here. Those are the things that cover the cost of the core mission and the activities that support the university in addition to that. Next. And conversely, a capital budget is specific to construction and major campus planning projects, including renovations and facilities upkeep, but also large and technical equipment and large information technology projects. In this area, funds coming in, typically there's some come from operating, but also from reserves, from grants, from loans, from gifts, typically larger things that we will use over a period of time to conduct these capital projects. And the expenses associated with that are typically capitalized. In other words, they're built up as assets on our balance sheet and then depreciated over time. Very, very often covering a number of years to put that together. Next. So there are a number of different budget processes across different universities, institutions. There are 4 types in particular that institutions use. Often they're a combination of these. You will see in many institutions incremental budgets where they simply increase or decrease from the prior year's budget year over year. There might be formula-based ones. Some of these are relating to state performance funding or zero-based budgeting for particular activities that hone in on in particular measures as the way to allocate funds. Responsibility Center, this is the model that we use at Rutgers and have been using since 2016. This model puts units that raise revenue in control of their direct revenues and expenses, but also having a share of the indirect expenditures for the operating of the university, whether that be at a chancellor level or a central. Excuse me again. So Rutgers, we have actually a combination of these. Our primary one is RCM, but certainly in distributed areas, incremental and formula-based budgets are in fact, mechanisms are in fact used here. Next. Generally speaking, RCM works like this, and it may apply to a portion of the overall budget where units are classified into certain categories. Revenues are allocated to those. In other words, tuition flows, for instance, to the school that earns it by teaching, but also by enrollment. Those units are responsible for their direct costs and a share of the institution's indirect costs, along with funding for strategic initiatives, and then assessments for university-wide costs are allocated through a variety of statistics, a variety of allocation methods to those individual units. Next. And at Rutgers, we only use the RCM tool to allocate a portion of the funds across the university. In particular, those indirect costs as they relate to either central administration or what I call the central administration of the chancellor-led units. Amongst those, and I'll show that in more detail in a moment, what kinds of things constitute that. But the responsibility centers at Rutgers are called the academic and auxiliary units. They also some of the major research centers are in that category. And then, as you might guess, direct expenses include the salaries, not salary operating costs, and so on. Whereas indirect expenses are shared services such as library, enrollment management, purchasing, et cetera. Next. We have 9 different types of support units. These can exist within at the institutional level or within a chancellor-led budget. The single largest one of these is the operation of our facilities, which in this particular slide here, these are the cost pools that we use, is under the operations and maintenance category, but also utilities. You could say indirectly, public safety also covers that space as well. There are things such as insurance costs and so on that are related to operations of facilities. And that's a major piece of this. And you'll see that shortly as we go through the details of the budget. The other categories, G&A, that's where I live. But that's also where my colleagues in the chancellor-led units live. Academic support, libraries, research administration, IT allocations, and then student services. Each one of these has a set of statistics that allow for the allocation across the entire university or within a particular chancellor-led unit. So the same statistics are used at each of those levels, but of course, costs that are associated with, say, for instance, New Brunswick only go to New Brunswick aligned schools. Next. To give an example of how this works, there's the academic support cost pool. This includes expenses such as enrollment, services, financial aid, student accounting. We use some revenues such as application acceptance fees to offset the costs, but the remainder is allocated to the academic and auxiliary units based on a proportional share of the prior year student headcount. If it is specific to undergraduates, we use an undergraduate headcount. If a function is specific to graduates, likewise that. If it's for both, if it's for all students, we use a composite. And there is an example on the page here of that. Next. And interestingly enough, yesterday, so we have a Big Ten CFO group. There are a lot of Big Ten groups, as you know. And one of my colleagues at the interim CFO at Indiana University started a survey to ask about budget approaches across the group. And we are very collaborative. I think the only one we didn't get an answer for was Oregon, and they just haven't responded back yet. But this gives you an idea of where each of these functions are. So Minnesota, Indiana, USC, and Rutgers are traditionally, if you will, fully RCM, whereas there are modifications of those where there's maybe a combination of some incremental work or some off-the-top tax kind of setup in places like Ohio State, University of Washington, University of Illinois, and so on. The ones on the right have remained mostly incremental. I do know that Michigan State is moving towards an RCM model. They're just working in their transition presently. It was very interesting that we happened to get this survey and the results to it just yesterday. So I've talked enough now. I want to turn over now to my colleagues who are going to talk about the real topic here, and that is giving you information about this university's budget and how that works. I'd like to introduce David Moore. He's our Vice President for Financial Planning and Analysis and the Chief Budget Officer for the university. He's going to give you an overview of the university budget in total, but also how the budgeting for the central administration is for this year. David, over to you, please.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And welcome to everyone. I'm happy to be here today. My name is David Moore, and together with my team, we provide support for the university's financial planning, budgeting, and reporting across Rutgers University. We work closely with the chancellor units at each campus to facilitate the development of the university's financial plan. Today, I will cover the FY25 consolidated total university budget. I will then be followed by my colleagues at each campus who will provide an overview of their campus budget. My presentation will be at the consolidated university total level and will focus on how we spend our resources and where the resources come from. Next slide. The fiscal year 2025 budget reflects the values of Rutgers University in fulfilling its core priorities of teaching, research, service, and healthcare. The budget reflects a statement of our priorities and values while taking steps to preserve access and affordability for our students here at Rutgers. Next slide, please. The fiscal year 2025 budget will spend approximately $5.6 billion on the things that are most important to us. As you can see from the pie chart, 77% is spent on our core missions of student instruction, research, public service, and healthcare. 15% is spent on operations and maintenance of our facilities and sports administration. 5% is spent on auxiliary enterprises, which is primarily housing, dining, and parking operations, and 3% is spent on athletics. Let's go to the next slide, please. So now let's explore the categories for a deeper understanding. Our core missions are made up of classroom instructions and academic support, which makes up approximately 1/3 of the total budget. The categories includes faculty compensation, staff support for academic units, libraries, as well as dean's offices. The budget supports and advances Rutgers' high-quality instruction and academic excellence. The next category is student services, scholarships, and financial aid, which comprises 11% of the total budget. This budget preserves and increases investments in student financial aid and scholarship funding while providing critical service for our students throughout their time at Rutgers. Sponsor research and other sponsored programs makes up approximately 12% of the budget and includes funds spent on research associated with federal, state, and non-governmental grants and contracts. Following that is our public service, extension, and healthcare, which includes agricultural extension programs, delivery of healthcare support for health clinics, and community service provided throughout the state, which accounts for 21% of the overall annual budget. Together, these items represents the core missions of the student instruction, research, public service, and healthcare that accounts for approximately 77% of the annual $5.6 billion budget. Let's go to the next slide, please. Rounding out the remaining 23% of the annual budget includes administration operation, which includes support for central administrative offices, as well as support for all Rutgers facilities, including upkeep and utility costs, which accounts for 15% of the budget. Auxiliary enterprises, which includes housing, dining, as well as parking operations, accounts for approximately 5% of the annual expense budget. And athletics, which includes the 24 men's and women's Division I sports programs at Rutgers, New Brunswick, accounts for approximately 3% of the annual budget. One note to make is that nearly 3/4 of the athletic budget is supported through funds generated by the athletic program. Next slide. As we were developing the FY 2025 financial plan, there was a number of upward pressures on costs. Few of those include salary increases, as well as rising costs in healthcare premiums and pension contributions, and inflation increases in supplies, travel, and other general operating expenses. Next slide. So when we turn to where the funds come from, we look at at a full funds flow. And approximately 27% of our projected annual revenues comes from tuition and fees. State of New Jersey, which includes the state appropriations that is received for each campus, and the state paid fringe benefits that the Rutgers University receives, represents approximately 21% of the university resources. Approximately half of the resource received from the state of New Jersey comes in unrestricted operating support, which is the funds that can be used for support the university operations. And the other portion is received to cover the cost of fringe benefits for some of our employees. The next category is healthcare and affiliate, which includes revenues from governmental payers, private insurers, and affiliated agreements for patient care services, which accounts for approximately 20% of the annual revenue budget. Moving over to the sponsor research, this funding includes grants and contracts from federal and state and non-governmental entities and makes up approximately 15% of the overall revenue. And rounding out the revenue budget is miscellaneous sources, which includes student, federal, and state financial aid, auxiliary enterprises, athletics, endowment and investment income, which accounts for 17% of the annual revenues. Before I move into the budgets by each campus, I would like to talk about our overall budget development process. Next slide. And next slide. Thank you. Rutgers has a process that follows the fiscal year starting in July and ending in June. Budgets are built at the campus level and then consolidated to form the total university financial plan. During the months of July through December, guidance is provided to the university and chancellor unit level support units with beginning the development of their budget for the next fiscal year. University support units meets with deans and directors in advisory roles to develop their budget requests, and further requests are presented to the university budget committee. From there, recommendations are developed in the university support units. Budgets are approved by the president and chancellors at each of the campuses. As we move into January through June time, school auxiliary units, centers, and institutes develop unit budgets and prepares the budget meetings with their respective chancellor offices. Budgets are reviewed and refined, and final budgets are submitted to the University Budget Office for review with the Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer, and ultimately consolidated into what is the Rutgers financial plan, which is presented to the Board of Governors in July. This allows time for Rutgers to receive state appropriation information from the New Jersey state budget process. Next slide. So one might ask, what is the state of New Jersey budget process? When we look at the New Jersey state budget process, we start in July as well. And through July through December, all state agencies and universities start with the budget preparation and submission of budget requests to be considered as the state develops its overall financial plan for the following fiscal year. During this time at the state level, the Governor's Office of Management and Budget starts with reviewing and updating annual economic forecasts, which will aid in setting revenue estimates that are used for the following fiscal year budget. This helps determine the amount of resources that the state has to develop its budget. Moving into January through March time, budget requests submitted by the state agencies and universities are reviewed by the Office of Management and Budget recommendations are then made, and final decisions from Office of Management and Budget are prepared into the overall annual budget bill. The governor then introduces the budget bill to the state citizens and also to the legislature. From there, the bill will enter into what is called the legislative action process, and the bill is amended to develop changes that the legislature would like to see. Once that comes from the legislature and is finally adopted by the legislature, it is then sent to the governor for final approval. That does happen typically more so in the most recent years, late in June. Next slide. Now that I've shared with you the overall consolidated budget and the budget development process, I will now turn to Rutgers Central for FY 2025 budget. Next slide. Rutgers Central has the following revenue sources and internal revenue sources. One is an internal transfer to support costs associated with the maintenance and operation of university facilities, which includes utilities and upkeep of facilities. In addition, the internal transfer supports costs associated with services provided across the campuses. The internal transfer is shown as Rutgers administrative and facility allocation and is developed through the RCM tool that Mike talked about. Another source of funds is the federal and state aid funds that come in for financial aid. Federal funds support awards for Pell Grants, Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grants, or FSEOG, and the Federal Work Study Program. While student financial aid is, while the state student financial aid is supported by the Tuition Assistance Grant, or sometimes referred to as the TAG funds, and the Garden State Guarantee funds that complement institutional financial aid for similar to the Scarlet Guarantee at Rutgers New Brunswick, Run to the Top at Rutgers Newark, and Bridging the Gap at Rutgers Camden. The next category is the New Jersey State Appropriation. As I shared in a previous slide, Rutgers receives resources from the state of New Jersey, and approximately half of the funds support operations at each campus, and the funds shown in central is used to help is used as intended to help reduce the overall fringe benefit charge to federal research awards. In addition, there is fringe benefit cost for some of the positions, which is supported through the state paid fringe resources that is shown here. Tuition fees is the next category, and this funding represents student fees provided to support the student transportation via use of the buses around Rutgers, New Brunswick. In addition, student recreation funds to support direct debt service, technology fees for computing services, and fees charged for the activities and programs that can be selected through Rutgers Global. There is a category here with miscellaneous sources, and that has a combination of gifts and contributions as well as endowment investment income. Next slide. When we look at Rutgers Central for the expense side, as we turn to the looking at the salaries and wages as well as the fringe benefits, both of those come together as the total compensation and represents approximately 46% of the total budget. Scholarships and fellowships that are primarily supported by federal and state student aid resources make up approximately 23%, followed by debt service, which makes up approximately 10% and supports the principal and interest payments on debt that has been issued for capital and infrastructure projects. With the combination of supplies, professional services, and other operating expenses, this makes up approximately 21% of the central budget, and this helps support the teaching, research, public service, and healthcare missions at Rutgers, which includes facilities operation maintenance, utility costs, general insurance, library activity and support, information technology, research support, human resources, finance, and legal services, just to name a few of the support. These costs are not unique to Rutgers. These are common costs associated with the operations of a large public research university. Next slide. I will now turn the presentation over to my colleague, Nayland Smith, Senior Vice Chancellor for Finance and Chief Business Officer for Rutgers New Brunswick.
Good morning. Thank you, David. As David mentioned, my name is Nayland Smith, Senior Vice Chancellor of Finance and Administration and Chief Business Officer for New Brunswick. I report into Chancellor Francine Conway and our university CFO, Mike Gower. Now, before I delve into the factors shaping the FY25 budget, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the budget process. Within my purview, I have 12 academic units. That includes the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, 5 institutes, dining, and student affairs. Each fall, campus leaders, including deans and directors, prepare a budget guided by their respective unit-specific priorities, which do ladder up to the chancellor's campus priorities. Now, this process is facilitated through a budget template that guides each leader through the process. The template considers a number of things, including hiring plans, student success data, financial sustainability measures, and other special initiatives. The process culminates in a budget presentation to the chancellor and the CBO, me. And after some deliberations, final decisions are made, and the plans are then submitted to the central budget team to be incorporated into the general university budget. So with that said, I'll discuss the budget drivers for FY25. Next slide. So in FY25, we anticipate just over $2 billion in revenue. This pie chart breaks down the proportionality of the various revenue centers. The largest segment of this pie chart is tuition and fee revenue, which is a function of enrollment. And this accounts for $830 million, or 41% of the total revenue. So we are largely dependent on tuition and fees. Next, we have auxiliary enterprise revenue, which includes housing, dining, athletics, student affairs, parking, the bookstore, and a few other divisions. This segment accounts for $343 million, or 17% of the total revenue. So in total, tuition and fees plus auxiliary revenues make up the greatest share of our revenue base at 58%. I'll call your attention to the New Jersey State Appropriation segment, which is another key revenue source. These funds are allocated to the university to support operations. So this segment accounts for $235 million, or 12%. It's also worth noting that within the miscellaneous category is included federal appropriations that go to the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, which is a key feature of our land grant designation. Next slide. So enrollment is a key component of our financial sustainability strategy. This chart tells a very specific story about first-year enrollees. So during the COVID years, we experienced an overall decline in first-year enrollments. Pre-COVID, we had over 7,000 first-year enrollees. We dipped below 7,000 during the COVID years. This decline was acutely felt across out-of-state domestic and international enrollment. So as a strategy to grow tuition and fee revenue, we're focusing on growing out-of-state domestic and international enrollment. So on the chart, you will see a gradual increase in out-of-state domestic in the color gray and international enrollees in the color green. We project that revenues from first-year enrollees in FY25 will exceed FY24 actuals. So in this chart, you notice in gray, in the last column for FY25, out-of-state tuition is $33 million compared to $21.8 million in FY24, and international revenue is expected to deliver $27.6 million in FY25 versus $15.3 million in FY24. Now, this growth is expected to be supported by the Common App, which has significantly increased the pipeline of our applicants. Next slide, please. So some components of the auxiliary revenue segment, like housing and dining, are a function of enrollment. So with an increase in enrollment, we expect an increase in certain auxiliary revenues. So this chart shows that we have been steadily growing in housing occupancy post-COVID. And we expect to restore the housing occupancy to 97%, which was previously experienced in 2018. Also, we expect an increase in dining revenues by expanding the dining options to appeal to commuters and apartment residents. A 100 meal plan has been introduced to appeal to this specific population. Next slide, please. So research. Over the years, we've been experiencing a steady increase in grant and F&A revenue. We expect that trend to continue as more grants are submitted with a greater award success rate. So this chart shows a 1% year-over-year increase from FY24, which is just about $293 million, to FY25, where we have about $298 million. Next slide. So this is our expense breakdown. This chart shows the proportional distribution of our expenses. This year, we expect expenses to exceed revenue, so expenses will be over the 2 billion mark, leading to a deficit of 5.3 million. Almost 2/3 of the pie chart is related to compensation. Salaries account for 40% or 810 million, and fringe expense accounts for 327 million or 16%. So the combination of the two make up total compensation and accounts for 56% of our total expenses. There's also Rutgers administrative and facilities allocations. That accounts for 320 million or 16%. This allocation represents the proportional cost of operating university facilities and administrative operations. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that total compensation makes up 56% of our total expense budget. Within total compensation, faculty and postdocs make up about 50% of that number, and staff accounts for 39%, and students at 11%. So one key factor in the expense budget is the increase in salaries from the 3.25 to 3.5%. Another key driver of the expense budget is fringe expense. Our fringe rate changed from 63.95% to 72.94%. So once you layer in FICA and Medicare, the total composite fringe rate is over 80%. Next slide, please. A few years ago, we introduced the Scarlet Guarantee to the university. This program extends the work of the Garden State Guarantee. It offers accessibility to students who are economically disadvantaged. As you can see here, there are 3 tiers, with the base tier, tier 1, allowing the students to pay no tuition, and with the other 2 tiers minimizing the tuition. In 2025, we project that this program will serve over 4,000 students, but it will come with a cost of about $25 million. Next slide. Okay, thank you. I'll hand this over to my colleague, Arcelio Aponte. Thank you.
Thank you, Nayland. Sorry about that. As Nayland mentioned, my name is Arcelio Aponte. I'm the Senior Vice Chancellor and Chief Financial Officer for Rutgers University, Newark. I report into Interim Chancellor Jeffrey Robinson and to Mike Gower. Before I dive into the budget, next slide, please. Before I dive into the budget details, I want to mention that the budget that we present for Rutgers University, Newark, is aligned to our anchor institution mission. And our mission is built on access and affordability, student success, community engaged scholarship, and working very closely with our partners in the city of Newark. Next slide, please. So total budget revenue is $478 million. It's important to note that our budget is developed through collaboration and engagement with our central support units, local support units, our business officers, our deans, associate deans. It's really a collaborative process that the budget is developed through and then presented to the chancellor for approval. Next slide, please. As you can see here, our total revenue budget for FY25 is $478 million, built largely on tuition and fees, which represent 61%. Auxiliary services, as Nayland mentioned, account for housing and meal plans, is at 5% of our total revenues. If you account for both state appropriations and state fringe benefits, we have about 23% from state support, or just about $112 million. Miscellaneous sources, which includes gifts and grants and aid to students, is about 4%, with research rounding the pie out to about 7%. Next slide, please. To mention, as I mentioned in the previous slide, 61% of our operating revenues is from tuition and fees, which represents a 5.5% increase over 2024. We also accounted for an increase in auxiliary services of about 15%, with a target occupancy rate in our housing at 85%. I'm pleased to mention that this year in the fall of 2024, we've exceeded 90% in our occupancy. So positive trends for both tuition and fees. Illustrated on the graphs on the right. You can see here that over the past few years, both again tuition and fees and auxiliary services have been trending in a positive direction. Next slide, please. Important to our revenues drivers is our grants and contracts. We budgeted just under 28 million. It's important to note that, as I mentioned earlier, tied to our anchor institution work is our community engaged scholarship with the students at the center of our work. We have over 40 research centers led by faculty. We have about 300 active grants. Just to highlight a few of our recent grants, I want to point out that we have a $7.4 million award from the National Institute of Aging to support research on the aging of the African American community. And another grant received by our Small Business Development Center of $4.2 million from the New Jersey Department of Treasury, providing legal and financial advisory services to small businesses. Again, the research and the grants received really highlight how we benefit from our anchor institution work. Next slide, please. As for expenses, we invest in talent, attracting and retaining the best talent for our campus, invest in student outcomes, and you'll see more about that later. Certainly, we want to invest in efficient operations and trying to control cost, and invest in providing high level of services and facilities. Next slide, please. In terms of our overall expenses, we have a total budget of $494.5 million. By and large, the largest shares are salary and wages and fringe benefits combined at about 60%, followed by central support at about 20%, or just over $100 million. I'll talk a little bit more about scholarships and fellowships at 9% in our overall expenses, followed by professional services at 5%, and other services rounding off at about 6% in total. Next slide, please. In terms of our investments, as I mentioned earlier, we want to invest in attracting and retaining talent. Here we show our total compensation, as I mentioned earlier, is about 60% of our overall expenditures, or an increase of about 6.7%. Of the total compensation, faculty and postdocs expenditures that are about 60%, staff spending is about a third, and student spending is about 7%. It's important that I also point out that we've been successful in diversity hiring of faculty and postdocs through innovative approaches, such as cluster hiring and other initiatives that we've been investing in to again attract and retain the best talent. Next slide. We've invested in student support. As mentioned earlier, we have scholarship and fellowships of about $45.2 million. Our students have benefited from programs such as Run to the Top and Garden State Guarantee, receiving about $15 million in awards. It's important for us to ensure that our students are successful, so we also invest in programs such as our Care Team initiative, which provides mental health, food and security, and housing security services. We've also want to ensure that our students are ready for the workforce upon graduation, so we invest in programs such as Braven, which has enrolled over 1,600 of our students, And just to note that Braven Fellows accomplished 96% of those students are in the workforce or go on to graduate school. I believe that's my last slide, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Bob McGee. Bob?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Arcilio. Again, as mentioned, my name is Bob McKee. I'm the Senior Vice Chancellor and CFO at Rutgers-Camden. I report into Chancellor Antonio Tillis and to Mike Gower. Next slide. Realizing that I'm sure you have questions and we're running right up on time, I do want to give you a highlight of Camden's activities. We have an incredible student body, faculty, and staff that do wonderful things in a unique environment and demographics in Camden. Our revenues for FY25, our total budget is just under $212 million. You can see that we are heavily dependent on student tuition and fees. All of the student and tuition is the same across all campuses. Thus, we're working on the same percentages that are discussed each year going into the next semester. Additionally, you'll note a couple of things. In the gray, our New Jersey state appropriations actually increased this year. We received a $3 million special appropriation, and that was above and beyond what we previously received. And also, I'd like to point out our sponsored research continues to grow. Year to date, we're 62% above where we were this time last year, which is setting all-time records. Thanks to the work of our research office here in Camden, led by Tom Reish and our incredible faculty, we're enjoying that new venture. Next slide, please. Some of the revenue drivers, just to point out for you, the 25 budget was anticipated to rise in tuition and fees across the campus. We've had a static change in the enrollment overall. We've had some significant increases in grad enrollment as well as our international students. I previously mentioned the state appropriations, and we're very thankful to the state Assembly and Senate for providing that. Next slide, please. Some of the revenue drivers that are probably front of mind for you are relative to our students. Our housing has remained about static, but you can see in the last 2 years, it's increased. So our occupancy rates are going up, and we're trying to pay particular attention to the housing environment for our students, working with improvements and better areas of living for those people that are very dependent upon those. Additionally, we've had an increase in dining. That was twofold. That was due in part to reimagining our dining plans. We conducted a survey, and in that survey, we got back that a number of our plans were outdated, and we needed to update those that allowed for more flexibility or more use as need be. And as a result, we've seen a significant increase in the purchase of those dining plans. Next slide, please. We've also seen an increase, as I mentioned previously, in our research area. We have a notable increase in our grants and contracts at the end of this previous year, totaling 13.48%. And that's across many of our schools. Overall, our campus expects an 8% increase in our facility and administration recoveries, which is, again, in result of the rise in sponsored awards. Next slide, please. So looking at a pie graph, our expenses, the majority of our expenses are salary and wages and fringe benefits. We've all learned a lot about the increasing fringe benefits. So if you look at that, that's more than half the pie. We have some areas that are F&A charges, scholarships, and things like that. But again, overall, the major expense in Camden is faculty, staff, and our student workers. Next slide. Our expense drivers, again, the budget for salaries increased 2.5% over FY24, and the fringe benefits quite significantly at 8.5%. This resulted in an overall increase of $6.28 million in our personnel costs in just 1 year. This accounts for, again, an increase overall to $3.1 million. Next slide. So looking at some of our expense drivers across the campus, our scholarships are projected to rise. And again, this is good that we can continue to offer additional opportunities for our students. Our FY25 budget increases include additional travel. We're continuing to travel post-COVID, and that's a great opportunity, particularly for our faculty. And the 64% of the increase attributed to the allocations into faculty fund accounts. Our professional service expenses are expected to grow by about $932,000. This increase is primarily driven by dining. Our dining costs have increased significantly. We've seen, just as we have as individuals, the impact of going to the grocery, going to the gas station, and our increases have been very notably affected to our students here in Camden. Next slide. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Kathleen Bramwell, and talk to you about Rutgers Health. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Bob. My name is Kathleen Bramwell. I'm the Senior Vice Chancellor for Finance and Administration at Rutgers Health. I report directly into Chancellor Brian Strom and to Mike Gower. I understand that you want to get to the questions, and so I'm going to go through my presentation very quickly in the interest of getting to those questions. So if you have any questions about details I might have skipped, please do feel free to ask me. Next slide, please. As with my colleagues, this $2.3 billion budget for fiscal year 25 is a consolidation of all the work that our 18 units, deans and directors did all across RBHS Rutgers Health. Of the $2.3 billion, you can see there that $1.1 billion or 47% is comprised of revenues from our healthcare, our clinical enterprise. And the next largest source of revenue is sponsored research at 21% or $480 million. Next slide, please. I just want to take 1 minute and dig a little bit more deeply into the clinical revenues to explain that about 262 or 24% of the 1.1 billion is that typical fee for service that you usually see when a patient goes to see a provider of care and they bill their health insurance. That is what is comprised of the 24%. But because of the affiliation and the partnerships that we have with either the New Jersey Corrections Institute or our Robert Wood Johnson Barnabas Health or with University Hospital in Newark, basically the other 76% or $848 million is really what we're calling a direct reimbursement. As we send house staff, residents, fellows to rotate through another hospital, they pay us for those expenses. If one of our faculty members are providing services to a hospital, they pay us those invoices. And with the partnership with Robert Wood Johnson Barnabas Health, who are managing our outpatient practice, what they're doing is they're reimbursing us for any of the expenses that we incur on our books. The purpose of explaining this to you is so that you understand that that 76% or direct reimbursement does not come with a margin. We literally get reimbursed for expenses. But the good news there is that our hospital partners are paying for any practice losses. Across the whole country, faculty practices do lose money. And it's very good because we do not have to invest our money in those losses. The health system is absorbing those. Next slide, please. This is a look at our 8 schools. We start there with dental, the 2 medical schools, health professions, nursing, pharmacy, the School of Public Health, and our graduate school. You can see there their annual tuition and their fees. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, our next largest source of revenue, sponsored research at $480 million, is comprised of about 81% direct cost, paying for all those costs on the grants that all of you generate, and about 19% or $93 million of F&A, helping us to offset the cost of all the overhead, research administration in our facilities. It's important to note here that we remain committed to creative incentives for growth and research. And since fiscal year 19, Rutgers Health alone has grown about 44% in its research portfolio, and just fiscal year 24 over the previous year, another 3%. Next slide, please. This is a slide to just show that our historic revenue growth. When Chancellor Strom arrived in fiscal year 14, he had a very strong focus on a very successful academic medical center with a focus on revenue enhancement as opposed to expense remediation. And as a result of our partnerships with hospitals and other institutions, you can see that first red line there. We've grown to almost $1.1 billion in healthcare revenue. The next major source, as we've talked about, is sponsored programs, growing to over $560 million a year. The next line, the green line, is a growth in tuition that is both a rate increase and enrollment, and we continue to have a very strong focus on new gifts and endowments. Next slide, please. As with the rest of the university and my other colleagues and their CLUs, we spend over 71%, the dark blue shaded there, on salaries and fringe benefits at Rutgers Health. Next slide, please. And within that compensation, you can see that about 50% is spent on faculty and postdoctoral fellows, with about 41% spent on staff. Next slide, please. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to stop. This is just a slide to let you know some of the other investments that we make with our revenue in non-personnel expenses. But again, as I mentioned, I wanted to save time for all of you to have questions. So I'm going to end my presentation here and turn it back over to our EVP, Mr. Michael Gower.
Thank you, excuse me, thank you, Kathy, and thanks to my other colleagues here. With this, when we designed this, was intended to provide a baseline of understanding of how the budget is put together. And as we do in our other town halls, we're going to now address as many of the submitted questions as we can. I apologize because I ran a little long, and put some pressure on that. So I'll stick around longer too to compensate for that. But anything we do not cover live, we will be putting a response specifically in writing with the materials and letting everybody in the Senate and the faculty councils know where to find those. But I appreciate my colleagues speeding it up since I put us behind to begin with. So with that, I want to turn over, ask Aaron to moderate the questions for us that have come in. And my colleagues and I will do our best to respond to those.
Thanks, Mike. And if the other CBOs come on as well, we can have the whole group here. So we had a couple of questions submitted in advance. The first one, it was also submitted here, so I'll go ahead and read it. I'm trying to understand how people receive full 261 days of work when pay periods cover 260 days, so 26 pay periods for 10 days each. According to HR, you take the annual pay and then multiply it. So this equates to 260 pay days. How do you provide workers, or can you explain how you provide workers with the last one day of pay that they're not compensated for? Is that last day of pay in one of the checks at the end of the year?
Aaron, I can take that if you don't mind. The reason I'd like to take that is because I too was a little bit confused about that when I first got here. But what actually we do, and this is even done at the state, is that the actual working days in a fiscal year, July through June, are counted. And your annual salary is then divided by the actual working days, whether it's 260, so it's a little more per day, or 261, and there are occasionally 262 days. And then it's multiplied by your paycheck, the 10 working days. So in fact, in a fiscal year, you are actually getting paid for every day that you're working. It's really, it's just called compensation based on the daily rate of pay. So it's based on the actual days in a fiscal year that you're working. And if you can count them up, which I've done, it actually does work. So fiscal year 24, 260 working days in that fiscal year. And currently in fiscal year 25, there are 261 working days. And we will be at 260 working days for the next couple fiscal years. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Kathy. Another question we received in advance, I'll direct to Bob McKee. It's a question about RU Camden. The question is, can you provide some detail about consultants at the Camden campus? How many have been hired? How much money? What's the hiring process? There's a whole series of questions, but tell us more about consultant work at the Camden campus.
Absolutely happy to answer, Aaron. So looking at our consulting from 2020 to current, we average about $526,000 a year in consultants. Over the past 2 years, we've continued to bring that down, and we're right just over 400,000 this past year. The large majority of this spend is for research services. We use McAllister and Quinn and Hanover Research. There's a few items that are sprinkled throughout the colleges, primarily our business school, in which they're bringing in consultants as actually part of the academic delivery. But overall, the large majority of that is for services as opposed to individuals.
Thank you, Bob. And there were a couple of other components to that question, specifically about like the tactical pieces of it. So because it was detailed, I wanted to break it up, but we will write to that questioner more detail on specifically things like the hiring process, what that looks like. A couple of questions came in about the RCM model. One in advance, how the RCM, the questioner is looking for information about how the RCM model continues to disadvantage the Camden campus. I would like to note another question that came in the Q&A that's related. In the responsibility center management model, school centers and other units are responsible for managing their own revenue and expenses while also contributing to central costs and services. However, undergraduate tuition rates vary across campuses. Why doesn't the RCM model account for these differences? If it does, why not collect only 10 to 30% of the profits instead of what seems like a system that takes away all the profits generated by school centers and units? This approach appears to penalize the efforts of deans and directors who work hard to increase enrollment and manage their units efficiently. I want to be clear, the reason why I put those questions together is the question we received in advance was how the RCM model continues to disadvantage the Camden campus. And this particular question submitted by someone at Rutgers Camden is actually general, so it's not specific to the campus, but it is about the RCM model and how it how it gets used. So for questioners in the webinar, as I note it, you can follow the answered questions and read them by opening up the Q&A field. Mike, would you be the first one to take that on?
Yeah, I'll start that. And just to clarify, one of the premises, it says that undergraduate tuition rates vary across campuses. That's generally speaking not the case. The tuition rate for SAS is the same no matter where you are, whether you be, for the schools of arts and sciences is the same. There are some tuition differentiations by individual schools, but for the most part, in both the undergraduate and the graduate areas, they are the same. And I mean the traditional graduate program, not professional ones. So there really isn't that kind of difference. What the difference is relative to Camden is scale and volume. It is relatively smaller campus. The scale of it is such that we have to be able to provide buildings and services and activities there that for a smaller population. That is the reason why the university has budgeted for Camden for as long as I've been here to send really to cover more of what is a structural deficit there. In other words, the university is putting in, I think, Bob, in this current year is in the $50 million range.
52.7, Mike.
Yeah, 52.7 million to balance out that scale issue. And I also want to take a bit of correction relative to when it says profits generated by the school centers and units. Schools, centers and units will show an operating profit only if you do not include the cost of the space that they're in, the cost of operating the campus, the cost of the services to their students, the cost of the services and functions that are necessary to run the university or provide services to employees. In other words, the costs that are in those indirects, they are real costs. They are part of running the university. And in fact, in a steady state situation, meaning I would say you go back to fiscal 19, which was the last quote unquote typical year. There are only 4 schools within the university that do not need either some kind of a subsidy through state appropriation or from university in general to break even. And that's normal for a state university. That is normal for a public university. We don't expect those. As I said, there are only 4 schools and they have unique circumstances where they don't require that. But instead, that's the point of the state use of the state appropriation and the use of the budgeting overall of the university. Now, in the current year, we have 2 units that are 2 units that are negative in their budget. And that's fine. That's what has happened relative to enrollments, cost structures, and so on. It cannot go on forever, but I believe that, barring something really unforeseen, Camden will always be invested in. Camden will always be, people don't like to use the word subsidized, but in fact that it is provided funds to provide the services where it is, because that's part of, the university's job and mission to provide those services in the state. Bob, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a very important point, Mike, is that in order for the responsibility centers to have those quote unquote profits returned, they have to make the profits. And right now, Camden is a deficit operation by nature of location, and again, all of the infrastructure costs that you mentioned.
Thank you. I'm gonna try to combine a few more questions so we can get some more in, and I highlight that Mike at least has indicated he'll try to stay late. It is recorded, so for those of you who might need to leave, you'll have this as well. A couple of questions, and I'll ask the CBOs or David to take this on. There are a couple of clarifying questions about where things show up in the budget. One is a category called student services, but based on that description, and I think this might have been RCM related, that described enrollment management operations. Which bucket or category would other student services fall into, such as academic advising, student wellness, and career development? And then another question was in our salary breakdowns, where is it possible to see administrator salaries? David, do you want to start with that or?
Sure. So in terms of student services, typically things that are facing for student services does fall in there, but it does depend if it's at, I think the slide that was referenced was talking about uh, some of the central services, but also too, those will follow the same pattern, if you will, student services at what we call the chancellor-led or local areas. So I hope that helps with that question. In terms of, Aaron, can you repeat the other question?
The administrator salaries is the other component.
So the administrator salary should fall under staff, when you saw those pieces of the pie chart. If they're coded as administrators and not, there could be some faculty that are in administration, as long as they're in the administrative role, they would fall under staff.
Okay, I'm like trying to figure out where to begin. I'm jumping around. This was a presentation about running Rutgers as a business, covering costs. And there were references to mission in terms of core activities, and we talked about personnel as major expense. But there was no detail given about how the budget is viewed and managed to specifically promote teaching, research, community service, and mission. And no content on budget management strategies for promoting Rutgers Key Advantage its people. So the question is, how specifically does the management of Rutgers budget promote research, teaching, and community service? And how do you manage the budget to attract and keep people, faculty, and staff?
Let me take that one on, and I'll be happy to have any of and Anna, thank you for the question. So yes, this presentation was about the structure of the budget, and because that was our intent to provide a baseline of understanding and an educational baseline of the components of it, and to make it very clear that it really is as we put together the university budget, is the sum of many, many parts that start with individual schools, centers, and so on, and work within the chancellor-led units. The primary focal points of preparing the budget year after year after year after year, the primary players are the chancellors and the deans. They are the ones who set the tone. They are the ones who set the guidelines. They're the ones who set the priorities. And then the deans, however, the individual schools work differently, but how individual schools work perhaps between deans and chairs and so on. But this model focuses on how the chancellors and the deans put their heads together annually and over time to invest in the teaching, research, service, and clinical care components. We as the business officers don't do that. We are basically the traffic cops that make things work through. We also provide detailed information in terms of assumptions be used in the budgeting process, but in terms of enrollments, which drives things, in terms of grant activity, which drives things, in terms of clinical activity, there's other service activity, and then how those things are staffed, that is done within the chancellors and the deans or the center directors as appropriately. So not trying to deflect that question, but that is a question for the chancellors. And I think there is supposed to be some time devoted in the future with the chancellors to talk about budget management and talk about budget priorities. And I think that'd be an appropriate conversation. And I'll be part of that too, to provide technical support. But that is absolutely the direction. And I should say the direction from the president, which is very high level in this stage, is really around Overarching things that may cross the chancellor-led units, and overall priorities, the university as a whole. His involvement in the individual pieces of the budget is relatively limited. But I will say that the president and the chancellor are the ones who ultimately approve or do not approve or require changes to the administrative budgets. They are the governors of those, and primarily they flow back to the to units. Now, I want to pick up one other question because it relates to it, and thanks HP for the question. How can we educate deans and chairs on the potential flexibility of RCM so they don't treat it as a deterrent to interdisciplinary programs? Continuously discussing with them about that. The chancellors have said that, the chief business officers have said that, I've said that. As we go into the budget process with the academic units this year, I will reiterate that myself. Absolutely. We can maneuver RCM to support any kinds of structures that are appropriate for the institution, and we have done so in many instances. RCM is simply a tool. RCM is simply a tool to be able to account for all the indirect costs that it takes to run a university, especially a university of this size. But it is a tool to be used within the overall budget model. And that overall budget model, as I note, is largely controlled between the chancellors and the deans. So educating is the key word. And that is, we have a new crop of deans. Every time we have new deans coming in, try to emphasize or try to familiarize them in the model and what they should be doing to provide opportunities to work together. I think interdisciplinary programs are going to be critical for the new program developments that we will need coming forward.
Thanks, Mike. Have time for a couple more?
Yeah, let's do a few more.
I know
And
okay.
then,
So
as I said, we will respond in writing to each of these that we do not cover. And we'll provide those with the materials.
so there's a question early in the presentation about how much is the total revenue annually and how does that compare to the budget? So essentially it's a budget versus actuals question, and how the surplus or deficit that may exist gets reconciled.
David, that's you.
Yep. There's actually a report that that's on the website that we do an annual report looking at our budgets to actual. That is being completed for 24 and will be on the website after that, at the beginning of the calendar year, if you will. But we do go through and look at a budget to actuals. We do provide that information, and it's also an opportunity to look at the budget to actuals as it has compared to not only how the budget and the actuals came through, but also how it then ties back to our overall financial statements for the year. So I think when you go out there, or out to the website, what you'll see is the previous year budget actuals, and 24 is being compiled as we're talking.
Thank you. And I went ahead and put that link in the chat for those who are still on. Another question that came up that doesn't require us to prepare a chart, I don't think. Mike, this one's for you. Has it ever been considered to go to an outsourced chief investment office rather than running our own endowment internal to the university?
Yes, that was considered. When we first went to the model of professional management of the endowment as opposed to management through a consultant, which was about 8 years ago, I believe. We went through a full review of outsourced CIO options. And as opposed to being able to run our own with a CIO who works for us, we found that model not to be as flexible, but also more costly than it is to run it ourselves. And that is something that we always look at in terms of performance against peer groups and so on. And it varies year by year. It's something that we need to look at over the long run, really a 5 to 10 year period, but continually reassessed by the Joint Committee on Investments. I should point that the endowment, the oversight of the endowment or the control of the endowment is with a committee. It's the one joint committee between the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees called the Joint Committee on Investments, because those boards own the endowment and they have final control over how does it work. But I think we have an excellent chief investment officer now. And I think they've done a good job repositioning the endowment. Last year, we did better than peers and did better than our benchmarks. But it is a longer term period that you have to look at. There are a couple of questions here that we're going to get into more detail in responses, because they also do not they do not lend themselves to short answers. I refer to the comparison to peer schools, and we have information we can put together on that. The big picture of our budget shortfalls, I could spend another hour on that if you'd like, but I won't today, but we will provide some background on that. And then a follow-up question relative to capital investments. Or decisions on capital, and that being a very tough one, given that we have a lot of capital needs and relatively little borrowing capacity and almost no funding on the foreground from the state on that. So I want to provide full answers to those, and we'll be doing that immediately following this, probably within the next week. So I want to thank everybody here, thank my colleagues who did this. As I said, we're going to have at least one more of these in the spring. And given that we have put together a baseline here of how it works or how it's put together, I think then we can spend some more time on policy questions or some more deeper questions on priorities going forward. Again, I recommend that the chancellors get engaged in these conversations. I think that is being planned. I also invite all of you to participate in the other programs that we put on, the next one being the Finance Town Hall on November 6th. I'm going to be going into the top 5 business issues there, and we'll have some other topics that we'll be putting out when we put out the notice for that, as well as Cornerstone Town Hall to talk about the progress in particular of the new HR payroll system and other related projects. So I want to thank again everyone for attending. We will get answers back to everyone. Appreciate that. And we will try to, yes, all the questions in there. And I did capture the last one, Paul.
We got them.
Yeah, we will get those back in short order. So hope you all have a great day and thank you very much.